Hello again, everyone. This is Kellen Lynch with Housing Solutions Network. Today, we're recording another episode of the Permit Navigator, and today is our first with Everett Sorensen. Instead of just talking about ADU permitting, we've decided to branch out and talk about common questions that concern septic and stormwater, which specifically addresses folks in the county here in Jefferson County. Today's guest is Everett Sorensen of Evergreen Engineering Services. And a lot of the questions that we're going to ask him are also being answered on the environmental health website. And I'll include that in the video here. You can go to their frequently asked questions and see if your question is on there. But we hope to get to a lot of the common questions today. So Everett, why don't you introduce yourself and we'll get going.
Okay, I'm a civil engineer licensed in Washington, and I've been practicing in Jefferson County for about 13 years. I work on just about anything related to water, stormwater management, septic system design, and city infrastructure expansion, including water mains and such. So I'm just reading some of the common questions I've got compiled here. Are water and septic issues a large barrier to producing housing in Jefferson County? Well, yeah, they are. They can be a big barrier. So the problem is that the septic code's fairly strict, and in our county, easy to develop properties may have already been developed. And so a property that has challenges regarding septic is not likely to be developed yet. And so the available properties, more of them tend to have difficulties. Insufficient soil quality, or they don't have enough land area, or too many environmentally sensitive areas, wetlands, steep slopes, things like this. So yeah, it is quite a barrier. And generally, we advise people that they need to get their septic sorted out before they plan their building, because building planning really relies on septic design. So the first question is pretty obvious. What size septic system is needed? Generally, you need a septic system capacity that's rated for the number of bedrooms. However, the minimum is 2 bedrooms. So even an accessory dwelling unit that's just a studio apartment requires a 2-bedroom septic system, or 2 bedrooms of capacity on an existing system. Each bedroom of capacity equates to 120 gallons per day of peak discharge, or an average of 90 gallons per day, long-term average. That's based on 2 people living in that bedroom. So when you talk about a 3-bedroom septic system, for example, that's designed for a peak discharge of 360 gallons per day, or an average of 75% of that, which would be 270 gallons per day. So what's commonly, a very common thing, someone wants to add an ADU. Do they have enough capacity? You need to have an extra 2 bedrooms of septic system capacity on your septic system to be able to accommodate an ADU. If it's a 3-bedroom ADU, you need 3 bedrooms, but the minimum is always 2 bedrooms.
So essentially, you're always working in those increments of 2, so you can't have an odd number septic system. You can't just have a 3-bedroom septic system.
You can have a 3-bedroom septic system for a 2-bedroom house, no problem. You could even have like a 2.5 or 3.5 bedroom rated system as long as it exceeds the number of bedrooms.
Right. So you're always
counting
bedroom.
And counting 2 bedrooms for any separate structure has to have a minimum of 2 bedrooms of septic capacity. And not just a separate structure, but like an ADU can be adjoining, but it's considered a separate residence. So that would need 2-bedroom capacity for its own.
And when you say, the discharge of 120 gallons, that's how much you're releasing into the septic system daily?
Per day.
And that includes water.
These are peak ratings.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just your total wastewater volume,
okay,
which is 99% water generally, but they just go on the wastewater volume, right? Okay. So if you're buying land and you want to know what kind of septic system you need, we do a soil evaluation. And the soils are categorized in soil types 1 through 6. Soil type 1 is the coarsest most permeable, like gravels and gravelly sands. Soil type 2 is coarse sand, and on all the way up to really fine material like clays and silts. And with each different soil type, you need a different amount of minimum land area. So one of the questions that was posed by a sanitarian is that I have a piece of land that's not 12,500 square feet. What can I do? So 12,500 square feet is the minimum land area for soil type 2, coarse sands. It's the smallest minimum land area, because when you go down to soil type 1, excessively permeable, it jumps up to 22,000 square feet minimum land area. In any case, if you don't have that much land area, there's a formula that the county uses to determine what size can be allowed. It's essentially a fraction of, you take a fraction of what they call a domestic sewage unit, which is 450 gallons per day. Mm. And so, for example, if you have only 50%, or let's use a different number, let's say 66% of the minimum land area for a given soil type, you take that 66%, multiply it by the domestic sewage unit, which is 450 gallons per day, and that case came up to that would come out to 300 gallons per day. So you could be allowed on your small piece of land a system that can do 300, can accommodate 300 gallons per day, which is enough for a 2-bedroom system, but not enough for a 3-bedroom system.
Because
so this happens.
You need 120 peak capacity per bedroom.
Per bedroom, correct.
Per bedroom, so 240.
So 300. Yeah, so 300 gallons per day is not an even increment of 120, but it's more than 240, less than 360. That was just my example.
Yeah.
This comes up a lot in like Hadlock and Irondale, which are all on septic, and there are a lot of these small platted lots all over. Mm-hmm. Modern lots are platted based on the minimum land area for zoning, and those out in the county are generally plenty large for septic, like 5-acre minimum or 10-acre minimum or 20-acre minimum. Obviously, those are plenty large. Out in rural zoning, there's no more new lots being created that are smaller than, say, 5 acres. If they're on a community water supply, that's a different story. By the way, I should clarify. Those minimum land areas that I mentioned, 12,500 square feet, and so those are all assuming you have a water supply. If you have a water well on the property, the minimum land area is 1 acre. That's always the case. A common question is, if you have an existing septic system, here's the question: can I use the existing septic system to build a new home? And the answer is only if it meets current code. Mm-hmm. This is a fairly strict interpretation of state rules, but that's our county stance on this. A new house must be provided with a code compliant septic system. Mm-hmm. So if someone has an old septic system that's built to the previous code, it may not meet current code, and it won't be considered, if it doesn't meet current septic code, it's not considered adequate for a new house. The exception is RVs. An RV can be brought in and connected to an existing system that doesn't meet current code, provided that septic system is functioning properly, as determined by a professional inspection.
Interesting. Okay.
Do I need a septic system if I use a composting toilet? And the answer is yes, you do need to have a gray water septic system. And the distinction between a gray water and a black water septic system is usually size and waste strength. Gray water isn't as high strength of wastewater as black water. And so when you're designing a gray water septic system, it actually is under the very same code as all septic systems. But because the waste strength is lower, just being gray water, you can use that in soils that might not be adequate for a full-on black water system.
Yeah.
The problem with this approach is that you also need a permit for your composting toilet, and it must be it must be an approved toilet manufacturer, composting toilet manufacturer. There's a list of Washington State approved composting toilets. So this approach of composting toilet coupled with gray water septic system, because you need both of the permits, it doesn't really provide a huge advantage. And so we rarely see that approach taken, unfortunately.
So the composting toilet takes care of the solids of the waste stream, and the gray water system takes care of, I'm assuming there's not a urine diversion piece of that, but it takes care of like the stuff going down the sink and the shower.
Correct. Gray water is everything except toilet waste.
Uh-huh.
Toilet wastewater.
So you just don't see folks permitting composting toilets in general?
I don't see it very often. The question is asked quite frequently, but once I tell them that you have to permit the toilet as well as the septic system, and you still need to have a tank and a drain field, the things that go along with a normal septic system.
Are there alternatives to that traditional gray water septic system as a way of doing something else that's not a tank in the ground, but is, a leach field? Or
not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
If you follow the septic code, which gray water systems have to follow, you have to have a septic tank. And the sizing, I think you get a break on the size of the tank that's required. What the county often does is they permit these systems for a number that's less than a 2-bedroom normal capacity. Therefore, down the road, someone can't go to the county and say, hey, we've got this 2-bedroom septic system. Why can't we hook our toilet up to it? And the first thing they say is, well, it's undersized. So I've seen that trick before, but honestly, it just doesn't happen very often. I've had one client that had in 13 years that had an existing gray water septic system and composting toilet, and they weren't happy with it. They wanted to upgrade and have a full-on black water system, and we did that.
Okay.
And a corollary to that question is, why can't I water my garden with my gray water? And the answer is that legally you can't, because that would involve some sort of a system that collects gray water, maybe in a tank, whatever. And the concern is that gray water can still carry pathogens, and that in a tank with no oxygen, there's strange biological reactions going on. It's definitely not potable water. So it's just not allowed. However, what we recommend to people, if you want to collect water in your kitchen sink from washing vegetables or maybe even washing dishes, and then take a bucket of water out and spread it over your garden, nobody's going to object to that. But strictly speaking, it's technically not legal. And designing a special drain, like a third drain in the kitchen that flows to a bucket, seems like a good idea, but the concern from environmental health is that they rely on the property owner to manage that properly, and so they don't permit that. Now, if you did that yourself, probably you're not going to upset anybody, but it's technically not legal.
Right. And in these times of drought, it seems like we should be more concerned with just having the water and getting the water to where it needs to be, rather than into a tank in the ground full of chemicals.
Well, yeah, and so that's why the informal approach, I think, is okay, but technically not sanctioned. Yeah. I have a 3-bedroom septic and a 2-bedroom home. Can I build a 1-bedroom ADU? Well, the shorter answer is no, you can't. An ADU, no matter how small, requires 2 bedrooms of septic system capacity. Can my neighbor and I share a septic system? Well, you can, but it's an administrative hassle. To do that, you need to have a properly sized system, and then you need to record covenants to both properties that describe this shared arrangement, and stipulate that if anything needs to change, they have to get environmental health approval and so on. It's a difficult procedure to get to have done. What I encounter more often, and not that often, but two adjacent properties owned by the same party that would like, and they'd like to share a septic system. It's a little more feasible because the covenants that are required, that the environmental health requires, are easy to execute when you own both properties.
Right.
And there might even be an easement required from one to another, but I don't remember exactly. Anyway, it's fairly difficult to share a septic system. How would I change anything about how permits are given for water or septic systems right now? Well, one approach that Clallam County uses, that the designers that I've talked to, I don't design in Clallam County, but what they do is early on in the stages of septic system planning, the county sanitarian in Clallam County meet the septic designer on site and discuss and look at soil evaluation holes together and come to an agreement on the site of what the soil characteristics are and how thick of soil is available, and what type of septic system is appropriate. And then they leave that site meeting and the designer can proceed with producing a design knowing that environmental health is already on board. In our county, we do it differently. We evaluate soil separately from the county on our own. That is a septic designer working with the property owner. We decide what the appropriate design is and produce a design, submit design and permit application to the county environmental health. Only at that point do they come out and look at the soil evaluation holes to decide if they concur with the soil evaluation. And so what happens occasionally and quite frequently then is a disagreement on the exact type of soil or how thick, available thickness of unsaturated soil, normally unsaturated soil. And that means that the county has to write a letter and say, well, we think you need to adjust such and such on your design and so on. And it can lead to delays, extra rounds of back and forth. So a lot of designers in our county have been pushing Jefferson County to switch to a system that's like Clallam. Right. They have resisted, and they have some argument for why our system is better, but I honestly can't remember their reason, and we're not about to change anytime soon as far as I can tell.
Right.
People call me up and ask if a property is going to be suitable for septic, and the most important issue is soils. So we want to evaluate soils, and I often advise people how they can begin that soil evaluation themselves. The minimum soil thickness that you need to permit a septic system is only 12 inches of normally unsaturated soil. And that can be determined by a hand excavation down to, say, 2 feet deep. Because what we're looking for when we look at the soil profile, we're looking for indications of historical prolonged saturation that occurs during wet season. When so if the soil is saturated beneath a septic drain field, there's no oxygen making its way into, or very, very little making its way into that saturated soil. And so we only consider the unsaturated thickness from ground surface down to be the soil that's effectively treating the wastewater, septic tank effluent, which is free of solids. And so we want to, the various designs and options for septic for different drain fields go from, say, 12 inches up to 5 feet of thickness of normally unsaturated soil. And this is beneath the infiltrative surface. So a typical drain field has trenches excavated, let's say 2 feet deep, and backfilled with gravel and with a pipe to send your septic tank effluent and distribute it into the ground. So we only look at from the bottom of that trench and downward when evaluating available soil. So when we say you need 12 inches of soil or 36 inches or 60 inches, that's from the bottom of the trench downward. And so for a conventional gravity discharge system, the minimum trench depth is about 12 inches, and that means your trenches are pretty shallow. And so depending on the soil type, you need between 3 and 5 feet of normally unsaturated soil thickness beneath your trenches And so that means you need between 4 feet and 6 feet minimum, depending on soil type, of unsaturated thickness. And if you want to have your trenches deeper, then you have to go even more deeper. And so someone can do hand excavation and discover that they have either hard pan or a restrictive layer, bedrock, not very common, but that's another restriction. Any restrictive layer means that defines your available thickness. But also, if we see signs of historical saturation, mottling is a classic one. It's that rust-colored bands from the natural redox reaction that occurs in an oxygen-deprived saturated situation. So these rust bands that show up when you dig, they often indicate how shallow the seasonally shallow groundwater can come up to during the wet season. And that's our limit of how much soil we have. Is that clear?
Mostly, yeah. So a strong clay soil is not great for septic then, because it doesn't allow permeation, right?
Exactly. It's considered restrictive.
Restrictive.
And a hard pan is very common around here. The technical term is glacial till. The compacted material, it was underneath glaciers for thousands of years. It becomes very compacted. And even though if you break it down, if you were to dig into that and break it up, it consists of sand and gravel and silts and so on. In its compact form, it may not allow permeation. And so it's considered restrictive. And then whenever you get to that, and you encounter that layer, that's your limit of available thickness.